to our webinar, our Lunch and Learn Socratic Seminar and Reader Response. I'm delighted to have Leslie Trail, who is a 9 through 12 English teacher at Eagleville School in Rutherford County. She's been a teacher at Eagleville School for 8 years. Leslie obtained her master's degree in educational leadership and has been a teacher consultant for the Middle Tennessee Writing Project. She's excited to share information with you today. And I'll make Leslie the presenter, and you'll be able to start the broadcast.
Thank you, Bethany. Hello. I'm glad to welcome you to our session today on the Reader Response Notebook and the Socratic Seminar. I teach at Eagleville School, which is a K through 12 school. One of my favorite things about being at Eagleville is that when I pull in the mornings with my 7-year-old daughter, we go to my classroom, and then as the day begins, she walks down the hall to her 2nd grade class, and I begin to teach my 10th and 12th grade classes. I have currently about 125 students. 100 of those students are sophomores, and then I teach a portion of the senior English classes as well. I actually teach all of the sophomores here at Eagleville School and began to implement the Socratic Seminar and Reader Response Notebooks just within the last few years after Common Core standards rolled out, and I attended one of the 10 core trainings about how to effectively implement Common Core. Ironically, when I began to roll that out, it coincided with a year that I moved from teaching 9th grade English and began teaching 10th grade English. Now, I certainly think, and it has been shown, that the Socratic Seminar and the Reader Response Notebook can work in any grade level, whether it's 4th grade or 12th grade. There are benefits to having students talk through and struggle with questions rather than just force-feeding them our answers. However, for me, it was a really beautiful thing because I went from teaching 9th graders, all of the 9th graders at our school, to teaching them again as 10th graders. So it allowed me to completely restructure how I teach and how my classroom works, which allowed them to feel like they had a different sophomore English experience from what they had encountered their freshman year. When I first started using a notebook in my class, it was a writer's notebook. It was fluid in that I allowed my students to write about whatever they wanted to write about, and it followed a lot of the mechanics that are espoused by the National Writing Project. It was effective for my students, but as Common Core rolled out, I realized that I needed to do something a little bit different. And the reason I needed to do something different was because there's this emphasis on being able to respond to what we read, with Common Core especially, and even more so with being able to respond to nonfiction texts. So I wanted my classroom to be balanced. I did not want to lose teaching literature and fiction, but I also wanted to be sure that my students were getting a plethora of nonfiction texts. So we began the Reader Response Notebook. Everything my students read, they will in some capacity write a response in the Reader Response Notebook. And then, after they've written, we will have a Socratic Seminar session about it. After the session, they will write again. So that the pattern is we read, we do a close read analysis where I've literally given them copies of what they're reading and they're annotating the text, because that's a skill that they're going to need whether they're in high school or in freshmen in college or beyond. They need to know how to annotate the text, and so we practice that on a regular basis. And then right next to where they've annotated the text, they write a response. So as I give my students articles, the first thing they do is put the title and the table of contents that they've created. And then they take that article and they staple it on the left side of their next blank page in their Reader Response Notebook. And last but certainly not least, on the right side of that same notebook, then they begin to write their response. At this point in the year, which is spring of this semester, my students, many of them, are starting their 2nd notebook because they have filled a notebook with readings and writings and their responses. The research tells us that the more we read, the better we're going to be able to think, the better we're going to be able to perform on tests. So while it's not direct, let's practice bubbling in and practice those skills that we need for those high-stakes tests, I certainly think, and it has certainly been proven, that giving our students more things to read and teaching them how to annotate the text will have a trickle effect onto those test scores. One of the keys to the Reader Response Notebook is that it has to be regular. Each week, I give my students an article of the week, and I will show you where I access those. I use two websites, Kelly Gallagher and Teaching the Core. Those links will be included later, and I'll actually walk you through what those websites look like. I also ask them to respond to readings that we're doing in class, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, poetry, any type of genre. They're writing before we have our seminar and then again after. And then anytime we're writing a major paper, for example, right now we're working on our big research paper, their drafting happens in their reader response notebook. Part of that is because it then forces them to revise, because I require them to show that revision in their notebook. It also gives them a place where they're able to go back and reference their writings, and it's an organized fashion, because I think one of the things that students really struggle with in high school is they just don't know how to organize their work. And so I'm giving them the framework for that organization. So as I promised, I'm going to show you where I find the articles. I'm going to take you first to Kelly Gallagher's site. Kelly Gallagher is the author of several fabulous books that help explain the importance of teaching students to read and teaching students to respond to those readings. And his was really the first site that I came across that provides literally an article of the week for every week. I can go back through all the way back to the beginning of the year and see all of the articles that he's offered. So typically on Friday, I will look at the article, read it, see if it's something I want my students to read, print it, provide it to my students, and then on Monday they have that article, and we do our close reading exercises every single Monday in class. If we don't do it in class, then they know that that's a homework expectation and that it has to be in their notebook before Friday. As far as taking up the notebooks, just mentioning when they have to have the article made me think that I need to mention to you that I take these up every 2 weeks. They are not cumbersome to grade, and I will show you the rubric in just a few minutes. The second site that I use is Teaching the Core. Teaching the Core spawned from Kelly Gallagher's site, and so he has a variety of resources that you can use. And let me just it didn't take me exactly to what I wanted to show you, so I wanted to come in a back way. And he also has multiple articles of the week. He will give you kind of a heads up if it's a controversial topic so that you can decide if that's something you really want to show your students. Sometimes he'll use an article from Kelly Gallagher's Article of the Weeks, and he also, in some of his articles, will provide the students with additional framework. I have found that this framework, these charts that are provided on this particular web page, are very effective, especially at the beginning of the year when your students might not fully understand what you need to do as you're doing a close reading. Also effective for showing your students how to close read is to model the strategy. I typically, the first 4 or 5 articles that my students do, will project through my Elmo the article that we're working on and model to them how we're going to close read. So we'll just take it a paragraph at a time. Of course, you know there are many close reading strategies that you can use with your students, and I try to implement a variety of those so that my students are experiencing and learning that there is more than one way to tackle the text. News ELA is another really great source for accessing articles for your students. One of the things that I like about the News ELA site is that if I have a classroom with students of a lot of different reading abilities, I can go into an article, and I'm just going to randomly choose one, and I can look at the lexile level of that article on the right side of my screen. I can then print this article in a variety of lexile levels so that if I have a really sophisticated student whose reading is quite strong, that student has a more sophisticated, more difficult lexile than perhaps a student who struggles with reading. But when it comes time to discuss, we're all talking about the same article. We're all reading the same ideas, just the way the words are written are a little bit different. At the beginning of the year, my students receive a rubric. This rubric shows them exactly what I will do as I grade their reader response notebooks. Within the rubric, for example, within this written response, if we're working on a particular skill, I will then give them another checklist that says your 30 points are going to come from how you're integrating quotes, or how you've used commas, or how you've set up your thesis statement and then followed up with quotes from your source material, so that this can become more specific than just the detail that's on this particular rubric. However, this shows them that organization is important. 20 points just for following the standard of, do you have a table of contents? Are your articles on the left, your writings on the right? Are things easy to find? And is your reader response notebook just for your readings and your responses? One reason I did that is because the first year I rolled out a writer's notebook, my students were not valuing the space of that notebook. And so they would turn it in, and I'm flipping through 20 pages of math and science and history homework to find their next writing. Well, when you're looking at 100 notebooks and they have multiple things that they've written, you don't want to spend the time flipping through pages to find where their next writing is. So adding in the organization requirement has greatly helped me to not be a frustrated grader. And then each article, you'll see at the bottom, has a close reading requirement. That's because my students need to practice how they're taking notes in the text. Again, I'm going to teach them 3 or 4 or even 5 different strategies for that. I will share some of those strategies with you in just a moment. And then my expectation is, as we're modeling those, they're also implementing them in their reader response notebook. Why do I use the notebook? Because I want them to understand how to close read. And I also want to increase their writing stamina. We know that when students get to college, one of the things they struggle with more than anything else is writing arguments. So what do I provide my students? Articles where they can form a claim. And then we talk about how to cite textual evidence, and they practice that. We also know that state testing is going to be moving towards more open responses as far as how students answer questions. No longer will it be simply multiple choice. They have to be able to explain their thinking. So this notebook is a practice so that we begin to understand as students how we explain what it is that we've decided about a particular text. Again, I've already mentioned the table of contents with the article on the left, with the close reading evidence, and then the written response on the right. That is key just for organization and for setting up the notebook. Now, just because that works for me in my classroom certainly does not mean that's how you would have to set up your notebook. You want to do what seems logical for your students as far as being able to have the text visible, and then also for you as far as being able to respond. So the first thing we have to do is teach our students how to close read. One of the best texts that I have found for teaching close reading is a book called Falling in Love with Close Reading, and it is a text that gave me several different strategies to use in teaching close reading. This particular book shows students how to read a text through a specific lens. So if I've given a student a fiction article and I want them to read the lens through analyzing how the setting affects the story, this book gives me the words to give them so that then they can respond appropriately to the text. I also ask students that they must give written comments on their articles, and they also must show that thinking on the actual page. So as students are working through an article, they're literally writing in the margin. If I've asked them to identify the main idea of each paragraph, I'm expecting that to go in the left-hand margin. Sometimes I'll ask them to identify the author's purpose, and that will go in the right margin. I will always ask them to circle any words or phrases that they don't understand. And then I will also ask them to identify the claim or the point of a particular article. As my students do that, this helps them become more adept at being able to develop their own claims and their own thesis statements, because they're beginning to learn and to see how a text may be put together. Now, I want to show you a text where I worked with my students and we worked through doing a close read together. This particular text comes from a book that does allow you to make copies for your students. The book is called Strange Bedfellows. It is a book that pairs texts to allow you to demonstrate with your students. Now, my students first did this in partners, where they read the text, and then they had to identify the types of satire that they were seeing in the article. Then they had to explain how he was poking fun. So these comments are things that my students said when we got into the Socratic Seminar. If they underlined something, they had to have a note in the right-hand margin that explained why they had underlined it. And then they were determining whether this argument or another letter was more effective. And at the end of their seminar, they decided this one was the more effective one. And they said it was because he showed examples based on the claim. Now, this is towards the end of the year where perhaps they're writing less in the margin. At the beginning of the year, literally, we're writing beside every single paragraph so that we're practicing finding the main point of each paragraph. And, of course, the goal of this particular text was about teaching them satire and helping them see how to analyze that satire. Another good strategy for showing students how to identify claim or how to do a close reading of a text is to provide them with the small sticky notes. As students are reading the text and you've provided them with small sticky notes, they will take those sticky notes and then place them on the text. This allows them, if they decide later on that the claim of a paper is something else, to change their mind, because then they simply move the sticky note. Now, I do require my students, once they finish their analysis, to go back to that sticky note and on the note explain why they've placed it where they have on the text. This allows me to see that they haven't randomly placed their notes just to get credit for the work that's been done. Because my students are reading and thinking, when it comes time for them to sit in a circle and discuss a topic, they are more likely to have something to say. Therefore, the reader response notebook has become, for me, a safe jump to the Socratic Seminar. In the Socratic Seminar, students are talking through the big ideas of a text. As they listen to their peers and as they participate in this seminar discussion, they are then able to change their thinking of the text. Now, there are many ways to put together a Socratic Seminar in a classroom, and really, the way that you decide to set up your seminar is going to be almost dictated by the mechanics of your class. I have some classes where when we go to a Socratic Seminar, we do one big circle, and all of my students are in the one big circle. Well, I have another class that has some very strong talkers in it, and then some students who maybe are a little bit more hesitant to talk. So I have quite strategically split my room so that we go into two smaller circles, and then I mediate between the two. But once my students have discussed a text and have questioned the text in their Socratic Seminar, then they go back and write again, and their writing has improved, their focus is clearer, and they're able to better articulate what it is they want to say about that text. Research says that Paideia seminars and other authentic forums that encourage students to wrestle with learning in a safe and supportive environment go a long way not only towards Common Core, but also towards engaging the most disinterested students. And I can say that I have seen that over and over again in my class. I use the Socratic Seminar in all levels of my class, whether it's a standard English class or an advanced honors English class. The discussion that comes out certainly is going to vary based on the thinking that the students are doing to the text, but regardless of the type of class I'm teaching, I am seeing that my students are more engaged, for one, because they know they're getting credit for discussing, for being a part of the Socratic Seminar, but also because they hear what their peers are saying, and suddenly they feel like they need to contribute so as not to be left out. Typically, if I have a student who has not been engaged in anything else in my room, when I put them in a circle and we begin a Socratic Seminar, that light bulb goes off and my students begin to be engaged. The shift in thinking here is that no longer am I, the teacher, opening their brains and pouring information in. Instead, my students own their learning. I ask the questions. That way I'm still driving what I need them to think about, what I need them to learn, but they're having to respond, and as they respond, they're using the text to back up their explanations. So therefore, they're driving the classroom, not me. Now, at the beginning of the year, I have to teach my students what I expect. So the first time we go into a Socratic seminar, we practice getting in a circle. If I don't spend just a little bit of time teaching my students how I expect them to move, how I expect them to set up their seats, how I expect them to engage in this discussion, then it's going to be a disaster later on. So day one, we get in a circle. And then we put our desks back into rows. And then we get in a circle again. And we do that just a couple of times so that the students begin to see how to move their desks and how that looks as they get into the setup to be a part of this discussion. After we have practiced our first seminar, which I typically give them a very high interest article, perhaps something that's even a little bit controversial for that first seminar to test the waters. After that first seminar, all I have to say to my students is, okay guys, we're about to have our discussion, and they automatically know how to go in the circle. They automatically know what engagement looks like because we've practiced it. During the very first seminar, I might time out the discussion 2 or 3 times to say, okay, let's talk about what's going on that's good here. Let's talk about what we need to work on. And even before that, before my students ever start talking, we spend time going over norms, expectations for academic talk. So I tell them I expect them to actively participate. I expect them to listen. I expect them to build on each other's ideas, to clarify an idea, and to use evidence. Then I provide them a rubric with those 5 things on it. Every student gets a check mark for the things that they do. Do they participate? Do they listen? Do they build on ideas? Do they clarify? Do they use evidence? And it's a little daily grade. So it requires every student to participate. Now, coming up with the questions is probably the most difficult part of leading the Socratic seminar. Because if my questions aren't good, my students have nothing to talk about. So I have to ask meaningful questions. Open-ended, the what-ifs, the debates, the compare, contrast, analyze, and always say cite textual evidence are typically the best questions to engage your students. You can't ask a yes or no question or a question that can quickly be found because then there's nothing to discuss. During the seminar, my role is real simple. I take notes. Now, I will often use my Interwrite board to take notes on the screen so that my students can see what's being projected. But if you don't have that technology, certainly just getting a big piece of chart paper and putting that up in your room. The reason you do that is so that when the discussion is over, your students have a wealth of, oh, this is what we said, and it will help them go into writing. Also, I don't want my students so focused on taking notes during the seminar that they're not actively listening and able to actively respond. As the students are part of the seminar, their role is to participate, to encourage each other to participate. So that may look like asking a student a question to say, you know, hey, I didn't really understand what you meant by that. Could you clarify that? Or so-and-so, you haven't contributed yet. Would you mind sharing your thoughts? So that they're challenging each other's thinking. And it's also teaching them how to question. I have also found through this process that my students will make connections between the text and what they're seeing in the news or in the movies or on TV that I never would have thought to bring into class, so that our classroom discussions are becoming much richer because of it. Again, students are given a rubric, and within that rubric they know that they must talk. They can't repeat what has been said. They have to come up with their own thoughts, so they can't just sit there and say, oh, I agree with you, that was right, because that's not going to be an effective seminar. That they should encourage each other and that they must support what they say with the text. The reason I use a circle is because when you're sitting in a circle, you can see every single person seated around you. I have to teach my students how to read nonverbal cues. And so through the process of being in a circle, they're learning those nonverbal communication skills to be able to carry on a conversation. In this age where so many of them spend so much of their time on their phones and their iPads and their other technical devices, this is a skill that we have to teach our students. And so setting up the seminar in a discussion format helps with that. Obviously, there are implications to their learning because they're going to begin to be higher order thinkings. They're going to be analyzing, synthesizing, and evaluating, which puts them in the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. It's going to help students who struggle with comprehension because they're listening to what their classmates understand and what their classmates are saying. And then that level of discussion, how deep the students go, builds on what each student has brought to the table. So once we finish the discussion, we always write. I have found that if I don't give my students time to unpack after the discussion, we might as well not have had the discussion at all. That time to sit back and think about what was said and reflect on what their classmates said is so important to their actually internalizing the skills that are being taught in that particular seminar session. At the end of each year, I ask my students to do a survey of my class. And when I did this with the students who had had me 2 years in a row, I was a little nervous about what they would say, because 2 years is a long time to sit in anyone's classroom. Almost unanimously, they came back with their favorite thing that they did was the Socratic Seminar. And they said it was because they could discuss their ideas. Because it's hard to put my thoughts on paper, and this made it easier to give my opinion. Because they could express their thoughts more thoroughly. Because they liked the discussion and how it helped them understand. Because it gave them a chance to hear everyone's thoughts while still expressing their own. And because it helps them hear more helpful ideas than just their own. And so those are the skills and the ideas that put together this particular seminar response of doing the notebook and then pulling that together and allowing the students to talk it out. I want to pause at this point and answer any questions that you might have.
I have one question.
Sure.
Do you use the Socratic seminars with novels and works of fiction?
Absolutely. I actually use it even more with my novels and works of fiction because that's where I'm trying to teach some of those real, the strategies of finding theme and finding figurative devices. And when I bring a piece of fiction to the class, some of those are going to be really difficult for my students to understand. They enjoy talking those things out. We just finished talking out Animal Farm, and it was really interesting to listen to my students make those connections between the novel and the Russian Revolution and how that all came together rather than just having them sit down and try to struggle with writing it.
Thank you. Thank you for attending our webinar. I invite you to check out our website, www.proedtn.org, and check out our free educator resources that we update on a monthly basis. Thank you, and please join us for future webinars.